You're listening to Rolling Recklessly, the podcast where dice hit the floor, paint gets spilled, and no game ever goes exactly as planned. I'm Grizzly, and here we dive headfirst into Warhammer, tabletop gaming, and the beautiful mess that is the hobby life. From epic crits to absolute disasters, we'll cover it all. So grab your minis, roll with me, and let's get reckless. Welcome back to Rolling Recklessly, the podcast where we dive into all things Warhammer Age of Sigmar. From sweeping lore and the great wars of the mortal realms, to the hobby desk and tabletop strategy, and everything in between. I'm your host, Robert, aka Grizzly, and today we're stepping into one of the most defining chapters of Age of Sigmar's history. In our last lore dive, we talked about the seeds of hope and the rise of Sigmar's cities, bastions of order that sprouted from the ashes of the Realm Gate Wars. But even as civilization began to take root, a shadow was growing in Shyish, the realm of death. While Sigmar and Alarielle worked to rebuild, Nagash, the great necromancer, had his own plans. Plans that would shake not just the mortal realms, but the very laws of magic themselves. This episode is about the Soul Wars, a conflict born of Nagash's hunger for absolute dominion over every soul, living or dead. We'll talk about his schemes, the creation of the Black Pyramid, and the cataclysmic Necroquake that shattered the balance of magic across every realm. We'll dive into the rise of the Nighthaunt, the torment of the Stormcast Eternals as their reforging becomes more cursed than ever, and the battles that defined the age of unending death. If the Realm Gate Wars were the dawn of a new era, the Soul Wars were the storm that followed, darker, colder, and more relentless. From this point on, Age of Sigmar would never be the same. So grab your dice, gather your courage, and let's walk into the shadow of Nagash together. To understand the Soul Wars, we first have to take a step into the shadow of Nagash himself, the great necromancer, lord of the undead, and self-proclaimed rightful ruler of all that lives and dies. For Nagash, the mortal realms are not a shared domain between gods, mortals, and spirits. They are his. Every soul, no matter where it draws breath, is in his eyes nothing more than fuel to his eternal empire of death. After the Realm Gate Wars, when Sigmar Stormcast had begun to carve out a future for order, Nagash turned inward. While the other gods of order busied themselves with reforging alliances and founding cities, Nagash was silent, but he was building. Deep within Shyish, the realm of death, he began the construction of his greatest weapon, the Black Pyramid. This was no ordinary monument. It was a vast necromantic engine designed to amplify and focus his power across every realm. Imagine a beacon, but instead of light, it pulsed with pure death magic. Waves of necrotic energy tuned to resonate with the ley lines of Shyish. These ley lines, veins of magic that crisscross the realm, naturally channel the energies of death. Nagash, in his genius, sought to use them as a foundation, weaving them together into a single lattice of power, all converging beneath the pyramid. The Black Pyramid was intended to be the anchor of his dominion. Through it, every soul in every realm, whether mortal, daemon, or spirit, would be bound to him. No afterlife untouched, no death unsupervised. In his mind, there was no free soul in existence, only his property waiting to be claimed. Of course, Nagash never works alone. Arcan the Black, his Mortarch of Sacrament and most loyal lieutenant, oversaw much of the pyramid's construction. Legions of skeletal thralls, Ossiarch bone masons, and countless Nighthaunt spirits toiled endlessly under his gaze. Even entire swaths of land in Shyish were reshaped, their energies redirected to fuel the project. The scale was immense, the kind of thing only a god could conceive, and only a god's arrogance could justify. And arrogance is exactly what defined this project. Nagash believed that the pyramid was flawless, that his design could not fail, but in weaving together so much raw death magic, he was tampering with forces that did not bend easily, even to him. The ley lines of Shyish are the roots of a great, gnarled tree, spreading in every direction, unpredictable and wild. By binding them into his design, Nagash assumed that he could control their flow. But any gardener knows, roots twist, break stone, and shift over time. His plan carried within it the seeds of instability, even if he refused to admit it. This was the stage being set. Sigmar planting seeds of civilization, hammering out cities like Hammerhall and Anchor to Hope, and Nagash planting a pyramid of death, a monument to inevitability. Two visions for the mortal realms, both claiming permanence, but both on a collision course. One thing that strikes me here is the duality of it all. Sigmar builds upward, cities that touch the skies, while Nagash builds downwards, tying ley lines of death to bind everything under him. Which is more fragile in the end, stone walls filled with hope, or death magic stitched into the veins of the very realm? For me, the Black Pyramid is one of the most ambitious, terrifying, and yet flawed plans in all of Age of Sigmar. It perfectly captures Nagash, a genius architect of death, but one who cannot see past his own arrogance. If the Black Pyramid was Nagash's great ambition, then the Necroquake was his great catastrophe. As the pyramid neared completion, death magic in Shai's grew unstable. The ley lines thrummed like a web of strained cords, carrying more energy than even the Mortarchs could fully control. Still, Nagash pressed forward. Convinced of his own perfection, he declared that through the Black Pyramid, death would extend its dominion across every realm. But when the pyramid was activated, the result was not the perfect binding Nagash had envisioned. It was the Necroquake. A tidal wave of raw Shai-Shin magic ripped outward in every direction, shaking the foundations of reality itself. Across the mortal realms, the ground split and shuddered. Storms of spectral energy tore through the cities. Countless souls were ripped from their rest and hurled screaming back into the world of the living. The veil of life and death, already thin in places, was shredded. Nagash had wanted a steady stream of souls bound to him. What he got instead was torrent. Uncontrolled, indiscriminate, and devastating. Every death god, every faction, every mortal felt the consequences. In Azir, Sigmar's reforging process was thrown into turmoil. The Stormcast, already cursed by their reforging, found their souls splintering faster. More of them began to lose memories, identities, and even their humanity. Each reforging became less of a return and more of a hollowing. In Gur and Akshi, tomes cracked open, releasing endless legions of Nighthaunt, the great first spectral army of the Soul Wars. From Lady Olynder to Kurdos Valentian, new horrors clawed their way into reality, feeding on the unending waves of magic. Even the forces of order and destruction felt it. In Ghyran, Sylvaneth groves warped under the weight of the death energy, their spirits twisted with sorrow and rage. Oryx, ever attuned to the raw magic of the realms, found their Wa energy surging strangely, mingling with death in chaotic ways. And even in Chamon, the metallic lands trembled under necrotic storms that rusted steel and blackened the earth. And perhaps most crucially, the Necroquake didn't just empower Nagash's forces, it shifted the balance of magic everywhere. Endless spells, manifestations of arcane power given shape, now roamed the realms unchecked. Wizards of every faction suddenly had new tools at their disposal, but also new risks. Their magic no longer fully under their control, the mortal realms themselves had become a stage where magic was volatile, unpredictable, and deadly. For Nagash, the Necroquake was both triumph and tragedy. His Nighthaunt legions surged, his reach extended farther than before, and the mortal realms were drowned in death. But he did not gain the flawless dominion he craved. The energy slipped through his grasp. Spreading chaos rather than order, his arrogance, once again, had sown instability into his grand design. The Soul Wars had begun, not as a perfect march of death across the realms, but as a storm, wild and uncontrollable. Nagash was stronger, yes, but so too were his rivals. The mortal realms would never be the same. With the Necroquake unleashed, the mortal realms were plunged into a new age, the Soul Wars. The first and most intermediate consequence was the rise of the Nighthaunt. Entire spectral host, once whispers and shaiish, now surged into the realms in numbers beyond counting. At their head was Lady Olynder, the Mortarch of Grief. Once a mortal queen who deceived her people and betrayed her kingdom, she was elevated by Nagash into a figure of endless sorrow and power. She embodied despair itself, her presence so heavy that mortals wept and withered in her shadow. Lady Olynder's Nighthaunt swept across the realms, a tide of ethereal killers, chain rasps, grimghast reapers, and hex wraiths, all manifestations of death unbound, carved paths of terror wherever they went. For many, this was the true face of the Necroquake. Not the pyramid, not Nagash himself, but the howling wraiths that turned the battlefields into graveyards. But the Soul Wars weren't just about the rise of the undead. They reshaped the struggle of every faction. For Sigmar, the reforging curse grew worse. The Necroquake accelerated the process, stripping more of his Stormcast of their humanity. Heroes returned from death hollowed, cold, and alien. Some, like Vandus Hammerhand, clung into their identities. But countless others became shadows of who they once were. What was once a blessing was now clearly revealed as a curse. In Shyish, Nagash's grip tightened. He raised the Ossiarch Bonereapers, disciplined legions crafted from bone and soul stuff, designed to be his perfect army. They weren't mindless like skeletons, nor wild like Nighthaunt. They were organized, tactical, and terrifying. For many, they represented the logical endpoint of Nagash's philosophy. Not just ruling death, but remaking it into precision war machines. Elsewhere, other factions scrambled to adapt. The Idoneth, who already preyed on souls to survive, found themselves both empowered and endangered by the flood of spirits. The Daughters of Khaine capitalized on the chaos, spreading their temples and bloody rites further across the realms. And even destruction felt the shift. Oryx and Gitz surged in energy as the realms themselves became more unstable, and Kragnos' eventual rise was seated in this age of imbalance. And yet, for all of his power, Nagash's triumph was not absolute. The Soul Wars were not a steady march of victory for death, but an era of constant struggle. His Mortarchs fought, yes, but Sigmar and the forces of order still held their cities. Destruction rampaged unchecked. Chaos itself continued to plot. Nagash unleashed a storm, but he could not cage it. This is the great irony of the Soul Wars. They began with Nagash seeking perfect control, yet what they gave him was chaos, suffering, and imbalance on a scale he could not even fully master. The mortal realms were forever scarred, but also forever changed. For me, the Soul Wars are one of the richest parts of Age of Sigmar's narrative. They gave us the Nighthaunt, one of the most thematic armies in the game, and they deepened the tragedy of the Stormcast. It wasn't just good versus evil anymore. It was flawed gods shaping flawed soldiers. The Soul Wars also remind us that every action in AOS is ripples outward. Nagash tried to claim everything, but in doing so, he changed everything, for himself and his enemies alike. The Soul Wars marked one of the most dramatic turning points in the history of Age of Sigmar. What began as Nagash's grand design to bind all souls became a storm that shook every faction and every battlefield. We saw the rise of the Nighthaunt, the sorrow of Lady Olynder spreading across the realms. We saw Sigmar's Stormcast reforging grow more cursed than ever before, and their souls fraying with each return. We saw the creation of the Ossiarch Bonereapers, Nagash's attempt at a perfect army, and we saw how every faction, from Idoneth to Daughters of Khaine to the Oryx, had to adapt to the world warped by the Necroquake. But for the Soul Wars also reminded us of a deeper truth about Age of Sigmar. Every triumph carries its cost. For all of his brilliance, Nagash gained only instability. For all of Sigmar's hope, his reforged champions grew hollow. Their realms didn't find peace, they found a storm. And yet, this storm is only the beginning, because out of the Soul Wars came new upheavals, rivalries that fractured alliances, gods who rose to the challenge, the balance, and destruction stirring in ways no one had expected. The seeds planted in this era would grow into the Broken Realm saga, a narrative that would see gods fall, realms shatter, and Kragnos, the end of empires, unleashed upon the world. So as we close this chapter on the Soul Wars, we reflect not just on Nagash's failures and success, but on how his ambition reshaped the mortal realms forever. And in our next Lord Addict, we'll dive towards those cracks in the foundation, the wars and the betrayals that led us into the Age of the Broken Realms, and ultimately to the dawn of 4th edition. Until then, may your crits be high, your paint never dry, and your rolls ever reckless.